You were never anything more than a glorified handyman, Dean, and everyone in this room finally sees it. In front of 300 employees, CEO Vanessa Sinclair fired Dean Foster, a single father whose badge read nothing but technical consultant. Dean did not argue. He carried his box out into the rain, pulled a garage photo from the recycling bin, and called Ruth Bennett with 4 words, "Fire all of them." Vanessa believed she had just erased the only man who could stop her $900 million sale. She had no idea that phone call had just detonated a plan 11 months in the making, and that she now had 6 hours left before she lost everything she thought was hers. So who is Dean Foster really? Before the walkout even starts, if you have not already, tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Now here is how Dean Foster took his company back. Dean Foster measured his mornings by pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Every weekday at 6:45, he stood in the kitchen of his house on the edge of Detroit pouring batter into a skillet while his 5-year-old son Eli sat on the counter stool announcing which dinosaur he wanted that day. Grace had been gone for 4 years now, taken by an illness that moved faster than anyone expected, and in the space she left behind, Dean had rebuilt his entire life around getting Eli to school by 8 and being home again by 3:15 in the afternoon. Nothing about those hours looked like the life of a man who owned 62% of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At Foster Precision Group, the aerospace and medical device manufacturer, his own father, George Edward Foster, had started in a rented garage decades earlier. Dean was known simply as the technical consultant who walked the production floor in a canvas jacket checking tolerances on machined parts and troubleshooting equipment nobody else wanted to touch. His badge read, contractor. New hires assumed he was somewhere between a mechanic and a ghost, a quiet man who appeared in the shop before anyone else and vanished before the after-work drinks started. None of them knew that 4 years earlier, in the worst months of his grief, Dean had walked into a board meeting and asked the company to hire someone else to run it. That someone had been Vanessa Sinclair. She arrived with a resume built for magazine covers, a talent for growth numbers, and a story about herself that she told so often it had started to feel true even to the people who knew better. Her mother had spent 30 years as a secretary for men who took credit for her ideas, and Vanessa had built her entire adult life around one private vow: she would never again be the person doing the work in a room where someone else got to stand at the podium. That hunger for recognition had once made her brilliant. Lately, it had started to curdle into something closer to entitlement, a quiet conviction that the company Dean built was really hers because she was the only one anyone actually saw running it. When Dean handed her the company, he had also done something no one at Foster Precision besides one person understood. He placed his controlling shares into a family trust called the G.E. Foster Trust, named after his father George Edward Foster, and structured to protect Eli's inheritance no matter what happened to him. Dean named himself the sole trustee. To the board that approved it, exhausted from watching him fall apart after Grace's death, it seemed like a grieving father quietly stepping back. Nobody imagined he intended to stay gone this long, and by the time Vanessa's tenure hardened into something resembling ownership, most of the board members who remembered the arrangement had already retired or been replaced by people she had personally recruited. Only one person on the entire floor knew who Dean Foster actually was. Ruth Bennett had worked in the company's finance department since the garage days back when payroll was calculated by hand, and Dean's father still swept the floor himself at closing time. Ruth never once called Dean by anything other than his first name, not even in private, because she understood something. Dean was only beginning to learn the hard way. A secret survives only as long as the people who keep it treat it like one. She watched him disappear into the role of consultant with the same steady patience she brought to a set of books that did not balance, waiting for the day the numbers would eventually tell her something true. The first signs that something had shifted arrived quietly enough that Dean almost let them pass. A framed photograph from the original garage showing a much younger Dean standing beside a welder named Tommy Reyes in front of their first machine disappeared from the main lobby. Dean found it weeks later face down in a cardboard box labeled Archive, as though someone had simply run out of patience for a story that did not center Vanessa. Around the same time, the orientation video for new employees stopped mentioning a founder at all, describing the company instead as the creation of a group of local tradesmen that Vanessa Sinclair had transformed into a national name. The apprenticeship program for trade school students, which had carried Dean's father's name since its founding, was quietly renamed the Sinclair Fellows Program. Dean told himself a photograph and a name were not the company itself. He had made peace with invisibility a long time ago, and he was not going to let his pride pick a fight that his son did not need him fighting. That peace lasted until the quarterly operations meeting when Vanessa proposed switching to a new titanium supplier offering materials 18% cheaper than their current vendor. The catch, buried 3 slides into her presentation, was that the new material lacked 2 of the durability certifications required for components used in surgical implants. Dean spoke up in a room where he almost never spoke, explaining as plainly as he could that a hairline fracture in the wrong component could fail inside a patient's body without warning. Vanessa let him finish. Then she smiled at the assembled managers and told them that Dean was, after all, only a machinery consultant, and that certifications like these were exactly the kind of legacy cost she was always having to justify to the board. A few people laughed because they were afraid of her. Others studied the table in front of them rather than meet Dean's eyes. Dean did not argue with her in the room. He simply opened his notebook and wrote a single word inside it: drift. That night, he quietly asked the quality department to run an independent review of the new titanium shipment, and then sat alone in his small shared office, studying invoices Vanessa had personally approved over the past year. One name kept appearing in amounts just large enough to matter and just small enough individually to avoid attention. Meridian Advisory Group paid $30,000 every month for consulting services that produced no reports, no deliverables, and as far as Dean could find, no actual employees. When he traced the company's registration, the address led back to Vanessa's younger brother, Julian Sinclair. The total already exceeded $1 million. This was no longer a story about a woman quietly erasing a man's name from a lobby wall. Someone was pulling money out of a company that still legally belonged to Dean and to his son. And Dean understood immediately that the titanium decision had not been an isolated failure of judgment. It was a symptom of something being built underneath the company's foundation, one invoice at a time, by someone who had learned exactly how much visibility a person needed to avoid before anyone thought to look closely. Dean met Ruth privately the following week and asked her to begin quietly preserving records. He wanted original invoices, timesheets, vendor contracts, approval emails, market rate comparisons, and any documentation of profit adjustments that seemed inconsistent with the company's real performance. Everything needed a date, a duplicate copy, and a location outside the company's own servers. Ruth did not ask what Dean intended to do with any of it. She only asked how far back he wanted her to look. Dean told her to go back until they found the beginning. While the two of them quietly built their case, Vanessa continued dismantling what remained of Dean's presence. His badge access to certain restricted areas was suddenly revoked without explanation, and a security guard who had known Dean for over a decade had to apologize while issuing him a visitor badge instead. Employees who had once pushed back on Vanessa's decisions found themselves demoted or reassigned to positions with no access to financial systems, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Weeks into their quiet investigation, Ruth discovered a confidential file that appeared on a shared drive for less than an hour before someone deleted it. She photographed every page before it disappeared. The file was labeled Project Crown, and what it described made both of them understand exactly how much time they no longer had. Vanessa was negotiating with an investment firm called Holloway Capital to sell a controlling stake in shares held by a family trust. The same trust that, though neither Ruth nor Dean said it aloud, yet clearly belonged to Dean's own family. The buyers believed the trust had no active manager at all, an impression Vanessa had carefully cultivated by presenting it to Holloway as an unmanaged asset left behind after a widow's death, ripe to be pressured into an undervalued sale. Dean found evidence that Vanessa was simultaneously inflating fabricated expenses, signing contracts deliberately priced below profitability, suppressing the company's real value on paper and preparing a mass layoff timed to make the company look like it desperately needed rescuing. To anyone watching from the outside, Foster Precision would soon look like a company in crisis, exactly the story Vanessa needed to justify selling it away at a fraction of its worth. At this point, only one piece of the picture remained hidden even from Ruth. She knew the trust was tied to Dean's family in some deep and personal way, but she did not yet know who controlled it or how much of the company that person actually owned. Dean chose not to tell her yet, not out of mistrust, but because some truths were safer carried alone until there was a plan strong enough to hold their weight. Dean faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could confront Vanessa publicly and immediately, but she controlled the servers, the narrative, and a board that barely remembered his name existed on any document more official than a visitor log. A public accusation without ironclad proof would let her erase the evidence overnight and repaint him as a bitter, unstable contractor lashing out at a successful executive. Or he could keep pretending to be exactly what she believed him to be: harmless, quiet, and beneath her notice. Dean chose silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of a man building a case brick by brick, invoice by invoice, waiting for the moment Vanessa would least expect the ground beneath her to move. That night, he sat at his kitchen table long after Eli had fallen asleep, spreading printed pages across the surface where his son usually did his coloring homework. He thought about his father, who had built the company's first machine with borrowed tools and a welding torch that only worked half the time, and about Grace, who had once sat at this same table double-checking the numbers on the company's very first payroll before either of them believed it would survive its second year. Dean understood that the quiet life he had chosen after her death was never meant to be a hiding place. It was meant to be a shelter, one he had built carefully enough that Eli would never have to know how close it came to collapsing. I thought, too, about the version of himself who had once run every meeting in this building, who had known every employee's name before Vanessa ever learned the layout of the parking lot. That man had disappeared so completely that even Dean sometimes forgot he still existed underneath the canvas jacket and the visitor badge. Looking at the evidence in front of him now, at the shell companies and the falsified invoices and the quiet theft of a legacy that was never Vanessa's to take, Dean understood that disappearing further was no longer an option. Somewhere between the titanium meeting and the discovery of Meridian Advisory Group, the man his father raised had started waking back up. He closed his notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and checked on Eli one last time before going to bed himself, already turning over in his mind exactly how long it would take Ruth to find the beginning of a story someone else had worked very hard to erase. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that only Dean and Ruth understood. By morning, he was still the quiet consultant in the canvas jacket, walking the floor and fixing machines that had nothing wrong with them, just to have a reason to be near the right filing cabinets. By night, after Eli was asleep and the house had gone still, Dean sat with Ruth in her small kitchen 2 streets over, building a case 1 page at a time inside a blue ledger that never once touched the company's own servers. The ledger grew heavier every week. Invoices from Meridian Advisory Group were laid beside real market rates for consulting work, showing a gap too wide to explain as generosity. A warehouse the company paid rent on turned out, when Ruth drove past it herself on a Saturday afternoon, to be nothing more than an empty parking lot with a chain-link fence and a faded sign. Purchase orders had been approved outside the normal chain of signatures. Contracts were priced just low enough to bleed the company slowly, and money moved through a string of shell companies that all seemed to end eventually at the same family name. The clearest piece came from an email Ruth found buried in a folder that was never meant to survive a routine cleanup. Julian had written to his sister with a warning dressed up as reassurance, telling her to keep everything quiet until the trust was settled, because after that, nothing else would matter. Dean read the message 3 times before closing his laptop, understanding for the first time just how far the two of them were willing to go, and how little time might be left before Holloway Capital finished whatever Vanessa had promised them. Dean brought in Margaret Boone, soon after, a calm and precise attorney who had handled small pieces of the family trust's paperwork over the years, without ever knowing how large the stakes had quietly become. Margaret listened to everything Dean laid out across her desk with the same even expression she might have used reviewing a lease agreement, and when he finished, she told him plainly that he was still not ready to act. Vanessa had a legal team control of every internal system and the loyalty of a board that had mostly never heard Dean's real name. One misstep now could let her frame him as the one stealing from the company instead of the other way around. Margaret asked Dean a question that stayed with him longer than he expected. She wanted to know how many board members currently serving even knew his name belonged to anyone other than a contractor on the shop floor. Dean did the math out loud slowly and realized the number was smaller than he had let himself admit. Most of the people who had approved his quiet exit 4 years earlier were gone, replaced one seat at a time by executives. Vanessa had personally courted people who owed her their positions and had no memory of a founder who once ran the place from behind a welding bench. That single fact reframed everything for Dean. This was not simply a matter of proving what Vanessa had done. It was a matter of proving who he was to people who had never known him as anything but invisible, and doing it with evidence so complete that no one in that room would have room left to doubt it. Margaret told him the only path forward was patience disguised as compliance, letting Vanessa believe she had already won, while the two of them quietly finished building the one thing she could not talk her way around. Margaret's caution turned out to be justified faster than any of them expected. Vanessa noticed unusual activity in the company's older financial records within weeks, the kind of quiet digital footprint left behind by someone pulling files late at night. She responded by ordering an audit of every computer in the finance department, restricting Ruth's access to several shared drives and instructing the security team to start logging anyone who badged in after regular hours. The net was tightening long before Dean and Ruth had enough evidence to be safe from it. One evening, an IT technician arrived to inspect Ruth's workstation nearly an hour earlier than scheduled, catching her in the middle of copying the last batch of files onto a drive she kept hidden in her purse. Dean, watching from the shop floor camera feed on his phone, deliberately triggered a fault in one of the production line motors, sending an alarm through the building loud enough to pull the entire IT team away to troubleshoot it. By the time they returned to Ruth's desk, she had already closed everything and was typing an unrelated spreadsheet with the calm of someone who had done far riskier things in her life than this. Vanessa was not finished, though. She called Ruth into her office the following morning and, in a voice pitched somewhere between concern and threat, reminded her how easily a woman close to retirement could lose her pension over something as simple as removing company documents without authorization. Ruth sat through the entire conversation without blinking, nodding at all the right moments, letting Vanessa believe the warning had landed exactly as intended. She thanked her for the reminder, walked back to her desk, and kept going anyway, telling Dean later that fear only works on people who still believe they have something left to protect that matters more than doing the right thing. The investigation was not the only thing quietly reshaping Dean's life. He nearly missed Eli's kindergarten dinosaur presentation one Thursday afternoon because he had been in the middle of securing a backup copy of financial records that could not wait until the next day. By the time he arrived, breathless and still smelling faintly of machine oil, Eli was already standing alone at the edge of the little stage, glancing again and again toward the empty folding chair that was supposed to be his father's. On the drive home, Eli asked quietly whether the machines needed his father more than he did. Dean did not have an answer ready, and the question sat in the car with them the rest of the way home, heavier than anything in the blue ledger. He recognized uncomfortably the shape of an old mistake trying to repeat itself, the same slow drift that had once cost him months of Eli's early childhood, while he buried himself in grief and spreadsheets after Grace died. Whatever he was building now to protect his son's future could not come at the cost of his son's present. Dean pulled the car over before they reached the house, turning around in his seat so Eli could see his face clearly. He told his son that nothing in any building mattered more than the two of them, and that if he was ever late again, it would not be because a machine needed him more, but because he was working to make sure nobody could ever take away the things that belonged to their family. Eli considered this with the serious expression he reserved for questions about dinosaurs and space, then asked if the bad machine had been fixed. Dean told him it had, even though the machine he meant had never been broken at all. That night, after Eli had finally fallen asleep clutching a plastic stegosaurus, Dean sat outside his door for a long while listening to the small, even sound of his breathing. He promised himself quietly and without ceremony that every late night from here forward would come with a plan attached a clear stopping point, a reason he could explain to himself in the morning. The company had already cost him 4 years of pretending not to be who he was. He was not going to let it cost him the version of Eli that only existed once. The call from Margaret came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. A courier had delivered a signed voting proxy to her office, a document declaring that the family trust had granted Vanessa Sinclair full authority to vote in favor of selling its controlling shares to Holloway Capital. Dean's name was printed clearly at the bottom beside a signature that looked at first glance exactly like his own. Dean told Margaret immediately that he had never signed anything of the kind, and she believed him before she even finished explaining why the document could not possibly be genuine. The notary listed on the page had let his license expire over a year earlier. The date on the form had clearly been altered after the fact, the ink slightly different from the rest of the text. Most disturbing of all, the signature had been produced using an old signature stamp, one that had sat untouched inside a safe in the CEO's office since the day Dean stepped back from running the company himself. Dean remembered that stamp. He had used it constantly in the years before Grace died, signing contracts and approvals so quickly that keeping a physical stamp on hand had once seemed like nothing more than a practical convenience. When he handed the company to Vanessa, the stamp had simply stayed behind in the office safe, a forgotten tool from a role nobody expected him to need again. Vanessa had taken that forgotten tool and used it to manufacture his voice, his authority, and his signature, all in service of selling away the one thing that was supposed to protect his son. Sitting in Margaret's office with the forged document between them, Dean felt something shift inside his chest that was different from anger, quieter, and colder. It was one thing for Vanessa to erase a photograph from a lobby wall or rename a program that had carried his father's name for years. It was another thing entirely for her to reach into a safe, find a piece of him she assumed was long forgotten, and use it to steal directly from the son he had spent 4 years trying to protect. Margaret watched him study the page for a long moment before finally asking what he wanted to do next, and Dean told her the only thing that made sense anymore: finish building the case and finish it faster than Vanessa expected. This was no longer only theft. Dean understood, sitting across from Margaret's desk with the fraudulent proxy between them, that Vanessa was no longer content with erasing his name from a lobby wall or a training video. She was actively impersonating him to complete a transaction that would strip Eli of an inheritance neither Grace nor Dean's father had ever intended to hand to a stranger. The goal was no longer simply gathering enough evidence to remove Vanessa from her position. It had become stopping a crime that was dangerously close to finishing itself. Margaret explained that Michigan law allowed a person to record a conversation they were personally part of without informing the other party. From that day forward, Dean carried a small recording device inside the inner pocket of his jacket. Everywhere he went inside the building, a quiet insurance policy against a woman who had already shown she was willing to forge his own signature. The company's 15th anniversary celebration gave Vanessa an opening she did not waste. She crossed the room to find Dean standing near the refreshment table and, in a tone that sounded almost gentle, told him she did not hate him at all. People like him, she said, were simply built to construct the factory floor. People like her were the ones who knew how to turn that floor into an empire. She called him, without lowering her voice enough to seem embarrassed by it, the muscle the company had once used for photographs. Dean said nothing. He let the words sit in the air between them, the recorder in his jacket capturing every syllable while his face gave away nothing at all. Somewhere underneath the stillness he had trained himself to wear for 4 years, something in him had gone completely quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes right before a decision hardens into something permanent. He thought briefly of his father, who had built the company's first machine with his own hands, and of how easily a woman who had never once picked up a tool could stand in this room and call that inheritance nothing more than furniture. His silence to Vanessa looked exactly like surrender, the quiet defeat of a man who finally understood his place. She walked away from that conversation more confident than she had been in months. certain that whatever resistance she had sensed in the building over the past year had finally worn itself out. She had no way of knowing that the recording in Dean's jacket would eventually be played back to her in a room she could not walk out of, and that the very words she used to dismiss him would become the clearest proof of exactly who she really was. Ruth's next discovery arrived only days later, and it confirmed what Dean had already suspected about how far Vanessa was willing to go to make the sale look justified. A spreadsheet hidden inside a folder labeled with an innocuous project code listed 60 employees scheduled for termination once the Holloway deal closed. Tommy Reyes, the same welder who had stood beside Dean in the old garage photograph, appeared 11th on the list. A quality supervisor who had raised concerns about the substandard titanium months earlier had already been forced onto unpaid leave, his family's health insurance set to lapse just weeks before his daughter's scheduled surgery. Another longtime employee had been pressured into signing a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a severance package barely large enough to cover 2 months of rent. Dean realized that Vanessa was not simply threatening his family's assets. She was using 60 other families as leverage, sacrificing their stability to make the company appear more fragile than it actually was, exactly the kind of story Holloway needed to justify buying it cheap. Ruth printed the list and set it on the table between them without a word, watching Dean's face as he read each name in silence. When he reached Tommy's, he set the paper down and sat back in his chair for a long moment, thinking of a man who had once stood beside him in a cold garage with nothing but borrowed tools and a shared belief that the work was worth doing right. Tommy had never asked for recognition, never once mentioned the years he had put into the company's earliest days, and now his name sat 11th on a list built to make a spreadsheet look leaner for a buyer who would never learn his name at all. It was in Margaret's office, surrounded by printouts of the termination list, that Dean finally told her something he had never told anyone outside his own family. 6 years earlier, back when he still ran the company directly and long before Vanessa ever walked through its doors, Foster Precision had come dangerously close to missing payroll for 200 employees during a brutal slump in orders. Dean had quietly sold several machines that belonged to his father and taken out a second mortgage on the house he shared with Grace, using the money to cover payroll without ever telling a single employee where the funds had come from. Margaret asked why he had never told anyone the truth about what he had done. Dean answered simply that he never wanted his employees to feel like they owed him something for simply keeping their jobs. Margaret's response landed harder than she probably intended, though her tone stayed gentle. She told him that his silence back then was the very reason Vanessa now believed he had never carried any real weight for this company at all, and that a man who hides his sacrifices eventually gets written out of his own story by people who never knew it happened. Dean sat with that for a long moment, recognizing the shape of his own worst habit staring back at him. Humility, he realized, was never supposed to mean allowing the truth to be quietly deleted by someone else. He had spent years believing that staying invisible protected the people around him, when in reality, it had only made it easier for Vanessa to convince an entire company that he had never been anything more than hired help standing near the machines. Ruth's final piece of intelligence came just days later when she located the confirmed closing schedule buried inside an executive calendar. The signing was set for Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the 12th floor conference room, with Holloway Capital finalizing its purchase of the shares and funds scheduled to transfer the following Monday morning. For the first time since the investigation began, Dean and Margaret had an actual date to work backward from. Margaret spent the following days assembling everything they would need. She drafted formal documents revoking the fraudulent proxy-prepared evidence, proving the signature had been forged, and drew up papers to convene an emergency board meeting the moment they had enough support to force one. Copies of the Blue Ledger were duplicated and secured outside the building, along with files intended for law enforcement and formal recommendations to suspend everyone directly involved in the fraud. The plan was simple in outline and enormous in weight: interrupt the transaction Friday morning before Vanessa realized exactly how much they already knew. Dean spent those same days trying to hold 2 entirely different lives steady at once. He still walked the shop floor each morning in his canvas jacket, still fixed machines that did not need fixing, still made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs before dropping Eli off at school. At night, he sat with Margaret and Ruth, going over every page of the plan, testing it for weaknesses, the way his father had once tested a weld before trusting it to hold weight. Nobody in either version of his life seemed to notice how carefully he was balancing them, and Dean told himself that was exactly how it needed to stay, at least until Friday. The plan lasted less than a day. Vanessa discovered unusual login activity tracing back to Ruth's credentials late Wednesday night, and within hours she understood with the sharp clarity of someone who had spent a year building an elaborate deception that Dean and Ruth were not simply loyal employees keeping busy. They were building a case against her, and if she waited until Friday afternoon as planned, there was a real chance they would beat her to it. Vanessa moved before dawn. Rather than waiting for the scheduled closing, she called an all-staff meeting for 10 o'clock Thursday morning, gathering nearly 300 employees into the main floor while a company camera crew streamed the announcement live to remote offices. Standing at the front of the room with the same composed authority that had made her a favorite of business magazines, Vanessa announced that Dean Foster's consulting contract was terminated effective immediately. 2 security guards escorted Dean out of the building within minutes, his badge deactivated before he had even reached the parking lot. His name quietly added to a list barring him from returning to the property. He did not resist, did not raise his voice, and did not look back at the 300 faces watching him go, though he felt every one of those eyes on his back as the doors closed behind him. In the same sweep, Ruth was placed on immediate suspension, her company laptop and phone confiscated at her desk, while stunned coworkers watched from a careful distance. The finance office was locked, and Vanessa personally instructed Holloway Capital to move the signing time up from 5 o'clock to 4:30, determined to close the deal before anyone had the chance to interfere. Vanessa followed the walkout with a company-wide warning that anyone caught sharing internal documents outside the building would face immediate legal action, a threat aimed squarely at Ruth and anyone who might still be quietly loyal to Dean. Margaret, working frantically from her office, discovered there was no realistic path to secure an emergency court order before the newly moved signing time. Worse, the forged proxy document was still being treated as fully legitimate inside Holloway's own records, with no reason yet for the buyers to question its authenticity. Dean and Ruth had lost physical access to the very building where the remaining evidence lived. Evidence that could still be altered or deleted by anyone loyal to Vanessa before the day was through. The signing itself was now only hours away, and if Vanessa managed to complete the sale before anyone could stop her, reclaiming the company afterward could take years of litigation with no guarantee of success. Everything Dean had built quietly over the past 11 months now hung on a handful of hours he had never planned for. Before leaving the property for what the guards clearly believed would be the last time, Dean slipped into the archive storage room and retrieved the discarded photograph of himself and Tommy Reyes standing in front of the very first machine his father ever bought. He walked out through the front doors into a hard, steady rain, pulling out his personal phone the moment he reached the sidewalk and dialing Ruth's number from memory. When she answered, Dean said only 4 words, quiet and certain in a way that surprised even him, or all of them. There was no anger in his voice when he said it, only the calm of a man who had spent 11 months waiting for a moment exactly like this one, and who finally understood that quiet patience had a limit, and that limit had just been reached the second Vanessa forged his signature and used 300 employees as an audience to remove him from the very company his father built. Ruth, who had already secured the final backup of the blue ledger somewhere far outside the company's reach, told him simply that she understood and that she would take care of everything on her end. There was no fear in her voice either, only the steadiness of a woman who had spent decades keeping the company's real numbers honest, even when it would have been far easier to look away. Dean asked her next to call Mrs. Whitfield, an old family friend, and have her pick Eli up from school that afternoon, since there was no telling how long the rest of his day would take. Standing alone in the rain with the framed photograph tucked under his jacket, Dean checked the time on his phone. It read 11 minutes past 10. He had less than 6 hours to walk back into a building that had just erased his name from its badge system, unravel a transaction that had taken nearly a year to prepare, and prove to a room full of strangers that the man they had just thrown out onto the street was never the trespasser at all. I thought of his father lifting the first machine off a delivery truck with nothing but a pulley and stubborn patience of grace at the kitchen table checking payroll numbers by hand, of Tommy welding through the night to finish an order nobody thought they could make. None of them had ever needed a title to prove what they had built, and for 4 years Dean had believed the same was true of him. Standing in the rain outside a building that no longer recognized his name, he understood that belief had never been wrong. It had simply run out of time to stay quiet. By 4:20, the 12th floor conference room stood ready. Vanessa sat at the head of the table beside Julian, flanked by lawyers and 2 representatives from Holloway Capital. A stack of contracts marked "Sign Here" spread across the polished surface between them. She believed the only person who could still stop her had already been thrown out of the building, and for the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself to look almost relaxed. Outside the window behind her, the rain that had followed Dean since morning was finally beginning to ease, though nobody in the room noticed it. Vanessa had spent the last several hours moving through the building like someone finishing a long project, checking signatures, confirming schedules, thanking Holloway's team for their patience through what she called an unnecessary delay. She had no reason yet to believe the delay had been anything other than a formality. The elevator doors opened at 4:26. Dean stepped out in a jacket still soaked through from the rain, Margaret at his left with a case full of legal filings, Ruth at his right carrying the blue ledger and a backup drive. 2 security guards moved to block them, but one had once been quietly kept on payroll by Dean himself during a rough year, and after a brief hesitation, both men stepped aside without a word. Vanessa ordered the guards to remove the disgruntled former contractor from her meeting. Margaret introduced herself instead as counsel for the GE Foster Trust and asked everyone at the table to stop signing immediately. Vanessa assumed Margaret had arrived to finalize the sale, still certain the trust was overseen by passive lawyers with no real stake in what happened to the company. Margaret placed the forged proxy on the table and walked through its problems one by one, pointing out the expired notary license, the altered date, and the signature stamp pulled from a safe that had not been opened in years. Then she said the sentence that changed everything in the room. Dean Foster was the founder of Foster Precision Group, the sole trustee of the GE Foster Trust, and the owner of 62% of the company, a man who had stepped back from daily operations 4 years earlier to raise his son, but who had never once given up ownership of what he built. The man Vanessa had fired that morning was not a bitter contractor. He was the owner of the very shares she was trying to sell. The Holloway representatives began quietly closing their folders, but Vanessa was not finished. She accused Dean of abandoning his role as chief executive, of hiding his ownership for years, of vanishing from every important meeting while she alone carried the company forward, only reappearing now that it had become valuable again. One board member seated near her, a longtime ally, spoke up in her defense, suggesting that Dean might own the shares, but Vanessa was clearly the one capable of actually running things. For a few tense minutes, the argument in the room stopped being about who owned the company and became instead about whether Dean could prove Vanessa had committed deliberate crimes rather than simply made difficult business choices no one else wanted to make. Ruth opened the blue ledger and laid it across the table. She showed invoices from a shell company paid for services that never existed. A warehouse rented for a lot that held nothing but weeds and a fence money quietly moved toward Julian's accounts contracts, priced to guarantee losses, and the termination list carrying 60 names, Tommy's among them. She placed beside it the printed email from Julian, the one promising his sister that nothing would matter once the trust was settled. Vanessa denied all of it, calling the evidence a convenient story, assembled by resentful employees with an axe to grind. Dean asked Margaret to play the recording from the anniversary party. His own voice arrived in the room first, but Vanessa's followed a moment later, calm and certain in a way that made 2 board members visibly flinch. "You were never the brains of this operation. You were just the muscle we used for photographs." Dean looked directly at her across the table before he spoke. "You got one thing right. I am the muscle is what kept this company standing while you quietly loosened every bolt underneath it." The Holloway representatives closed their folders completely and announced they were withdrawing from the deal, citing misleading information and clear signs of fraudulent ownership documents. Project Crown collapsed in that room in front of the very people it was designed to fool. Margaret called an emergency board meeting for that same evening. Vanessa tried once more, suggesting they handle everything quietly to avoid damaging the company's public reputation. Her voice steady even as the room around her had clearly already turned. Dean answered simply that she had 11 months to fix things quietly, and instead she spent those months renting his own signature. The board reviewed every page Ruth had gathered and voted to remove Vanessa for cause before the meeting ended. Ruth finalized termination paperwork that same night for 6 people directly tied to the fraud, including Julian, the procurement director, the employee who managed the Meridian contract, the communications lead, the branding director, and 1 executive who had helped conceal the missing files. Every decision carried documentation, dates, and evidence behind it. Dean fired no one out of anger. He only followed through on what had already been proven true. Vanessa left the building that night carrying an empty box, the same kind she had once handed to Dean. Walking through the lobby, she passed the garage photograph already rehung on the wall showing Dean and Tommy Reyes standing beside their first machine. No one mocked her. No one clapped. Employees who had watched her walk that same lobby with confidence for years now simply returned to their desks, the moment passing without ceremony on either side. She walked out into the same steady rain that had soaked Dean that morning, and the doors closed behind her the way they had closed behind him hours earlier. The legal consequences moved quickly after that. An independent audit confirmed millions of dollars funneled through shell companies over several years. Julian was arrested and began cooperating with investigators, hoping his cooperation might soften what was coming for him. Vanessa eventually pleaded to charges tied to fraud and falsified documents, and much of the diverted money was recovered for restitution. She was barred from holding an executive position at any publicly traded company again, her name quietly removed from the same magazine features that had once celebrated her rise. Foster Precision rebuilt quickly once the truth was out. The termination list of 60 employees was canceled entirely. Workers who had been quietly demoted were reinstated with back pay. The certified titanium supplier was restored, and Ruth became chief financial officer. Walt Greer stepped in as executive chairman. The apprenticeship program returned to carrying Dean's father's name, and Tommy Reyes was finally recognized publicly as one of the company's original founders. The morning that reinstatement letters went out, Ruth called Dean before he had even finished making breakfast, her voice steadier than he had heard it in months. She told him Tommy had cried reading his letter at his kitchen table, not because of the job itself, but because after all these years, someone had finally written his name down as one of the people who built the place. Dean stood in his own kitchen holding the phone, watching Eli stack pancakes on his plate, and found he could not speak for a moment either. Dean accepted the role of chairman of the board, but declined to return as full-time chief executive. When asked why, he said the company needed a full-time leader and Eli needed a full-time father, and there was only one of those 2 jobs he could not hand to anyone else. That same night, before the handshakes in the boardroom had even finished, Dean left quietly. It was Friday, and Eli was waiting at home for pancake night. His son had no idea his father had just unraveled a $900 million deal, walked out of a building that had banned him that same morning, and stopped a woman from stealing his own inheritance out from under him. He only asked if work had gone well that day. Dean sat beside him at the counter, still smelling faintly of rain, and said it had been one of the best days he could remember. Eli seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to arranging his dinosaur pancake into pieces small enough to eat. And for the first time in nearly a year, Dean let himself simply sit in the ordinary quiet of an evening that belonged to no one but the 2 of them. Months later, Dean tracked down and recovered one of the machines that had once belonged to his father, an old lathe, one of the several he had sold 6 years earlier to help cover payroll for 200 employees. It was placed in the company lobby beneath the garage photograph, next to a picture of Grace checking numbers on the day she first believed in what Dean was building. A small plaque beside it read that every company is built by somebody's hands. The final scene took place at the kitchen table where Dean and Eli were building a small birdhouse together on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Eli measured each piece of wood twice, tilting his head to one side the exact way Dean and his own father once had, entirely unaware he was repeating a habit passed down through 2 generations of men who built things with their hands. He asked if Dean had built the whole company by himself. Dean told him, no, that his grandfather built it with his hands, his mother built it with her mind. Tommy welded it together, and Ruth kept the numbers honest, and that many people had built it at once. Eli considered this for a moment, turning a small nail over between his fingers, then asked what his father's job had been in all of that. Dean held the last piece of wood steady, while his son hammered in the final nail and told him simply that his job was keeping it safe. The birdhouse came out slightly crooked, but it stood on its own, and Eli set it carefully on the windowsill where he could see it from the kitchen table every morning. Silence never meant absence. The greatest legacy a person leaves behind is not the name attached to it, but the way their child learns to live by everything they once quietly watched them do. If this story reminded you that quiet does not mean weak, and that the people who never raise their voice are often the ones holding the most weight, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you the moment it drops. Leave a comment below and let us know what stood out to you most. See you in the next one.